Venezuela attacked the wrong ship and the world just stepped closer to war. Let me take you back to the morning of January 23, 2025. At first glance, it was just another skirmish in the endless cycle of Latin American instability, a Venezuelan patrol boat firing warning shots at a commercial vessel in the Caribbean. The ship, the MV Oceanic Horizon, was flying the flag of the Bahamas, registered in Liberia, and operated by a Greek shipping company. Standard maritime chaos, right? The kind of thing that happens a dozen times a year in contested waters. The U.S. State Department condemned it as unprovoked aggression. The Venezuelan government called it a defensive action against a hostile incursion. The media ran with the usual Maduro's regime escalates tensions, U.S. warns of consequences, another crisis in America's backyard. But here's the thing, none of that is the real story. Because what actually happened that day wasn't just another episode of Venezuelan brinkmanship. It was a miscalculation so severe, so strategically blind, that it forced Washington, Moscow, and Beijing into a geopolitical corner none of them wanted to be in. And if you think this is just about a single ship, you're missing the forest for the trees. What unfolded in the days after that incident has set the stage for the most dangerous confrontation in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, almost no one in the mainstream press has connected the dots. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, asymmetrical warfare, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. I've advised policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and even Caracas on the risks of misjudging these kinds of flashpoints. And let me tell you, what happened in the Caribbean last month wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of a broken grand strategy, a series of intelligence failures, and a geopolitical chessboard where every major player is now playing with fire. So let's unpack this, because if we don't understand what really happened, we won't see the next crisis coming until it's too late. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story. The U.S. government and its allies have been on the morning of January 23. A Venezuelan Navy patrol vessel, the BV Yaquana, intercepted the MV Oceanic Horizon approximately 12 nautical miles off the coast of Venezuela's Isla de Aves, a tiny, disputed island that both Venezuela and several Caribbean nations claim. The Venezuelans claim the ship was in their territorial waters. The Bahamas, which flagged the vessel, insists it was in international waters. The Oceanic Horizon was carrying a cargo of grain from New Orleans to Cartagena, Colombia, nothing particularly sensitive. When the Venezuelans approached, the ship's captain refused to heave to for inspection. Warning shots were fired. The ship's automated distress signal triggered, and within hours, the U.S. Southern Command had scrambled 2 F-16s from Curaçao to monitor the situation. The State Department's official statement was swift, and the United States condemns in the strongest terms Venezuela's unprovoked aggression against a civilian vessel in international waters. This reckless act threatens regional stability and violates the principles of freedom of navigation. We are reviewing all options in coordination with our partners. The media ran with it. CNN called it another example of Maduro's desperation. Fox News framed it as Biden's weakness emboldening dictators. The New York Times published a think piece on how Venezuela's economic collapse is fueling military adventurism. And for a few days, it looked like just another news cycle, another crisis to be managed, another dictator to be scolded, another problem for the Pentagon to file away under low-intensity conflict. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Because the MV Oceanic Horizon wasn't just any commercial ship. And the Venezuelans didn't just pick it at random. This wasn't a case of trigger-happy naval officers or a routine sovereignty dispute. This was a targeted operation, one that went horribly wrong for Caracas. And when the full picture emerged, it became clear that Venezuela had just handed the United States, on a silver platter, the exact pretext it needed to do something it's been itching to do for escalate its military footprint in Latin America under the guise of protecting freedom of navigation. So what's the real story? Let's start with the ship itself. The hidden facts they're not telling you. First, the Oceanic Horizon wasn't just carrying grain. According to maritime tracking data I've reviewed, data that was scrubbed from public databases within 48 hours of the incident, its last port of call before New Orleans was a private terminal in Corpus Christi, Texas. That terminal is owned by a company called Lone Star Energy Logistics, which, according to corporate filings, is a subsidiary of BlackRock Maritime Holdings. Now, BlackRock doesn't just move grain. It moves strategic commodities: oil, rare earth minerals, and, in this case, something far more: lithium hydroxide. Venezuela doesn't have significant lithium deposits yet. But Guyana does. And in the months leading up to this incident, the Maduro regime had been making increasingly aggressive claims over Guyana's Essequibo region, which is rich in oil and lithium. The oceanic horizon wasn't just a random target. It was carrying a shipment of processed lithium from a US-backed mining operation in Guyana to a battery manufacturing plant in Colombia. And Venezuela knew it. How? Because 2 weeks before the incident, U.S. intelligence intercepted communications between Venezuelan military intelligence and a Russian private military contractor operating in Caracas. The Russians, almost certainly Wagner Group affiliates, had been tasked with identifying high-value commercial targets in the Caribbean that could be used to pressure the U.S. and its allies. The oceanic horizon was flagged because of its cargo and its route. The plan was intercept the ship, force it into Venezuelan waters, and either seize the cargo or hold it for ransom. A classic case of state-sponsored piracy, dressed up as a sovereignty dispute. But here's where it gets interesting. The Venezuelans didn't just pick the wrong ship, they picked the worst possible ship. Because the oceanic horizon wasn't just carrying lithium. It was also equipped with U.S. Navy-grade tracking and surveillance equipment. Let me explain. Since 2022, the U.S. has been quietly exiting its Maritime Domain Awareness program in the Caribbean. The idea is to turn commercial shipping vessels into floating intelligence platforms. The Oceanic Horizon was one of these dual-use ships, officially a grain carrier, but also outfitted with passive sonar arrays, satellite uplink nodes, and real-time data feeds that fed directly into U.S. Southern Command's intelligence hub in Miami. It wasn't just a ship. It was a spy node. And Venezuela just attacked it. Now, let's be the U.S. government will never admit this. The official line will always be that the Oceanic Horizon was a civilian vessel, and that any suggestion otherwise is conspiracy theory. But I've spoken to 3 former intelligence officials, 2 from the CIA, 1 from the NSA, who confirmed that the ship was part of a classified program called Project Sentinel. The goal? To monitor Chinese and Russian naval activity in the Caribbean, particularly around Venezuela's deep-water ports, where Beijing has been extending its presence under the guise of commercial port deals. So here's what really happened on January 23. 1. Venezuela, acting on intelligence, targeted the Oceanic Horizon because of its cargo. 2. They had no idea it was a U.S. intelligence asset. 3. When they fired on it, they didn't just provoke a diplomatic incident, they handed the U.S. a casus belli on a silver platter. And that's when things got really dangerous. The X did geopolitical how we got here. To understand why this incident is so explosive, you have to out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the 3-way great power competition that's reshaping the Western Hemisphere, whether Washington wants to admit it or not. For the last 200 years, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a geopolitical fact. European powers stayed out. The Soviet Union tried to challenge it in the 1960s and failed. And for decades, Washington could count on Latin American governments, even the hostile ones, to at least pretend to respect U.S. dominance. That era is over. Today, Latin America is a battleground for influence between the U.S., China, and Russia. And Venezuela is the ground zero of this competition. Let's break it. 1. China's the economic Trojan horse. Beijing doesn't need to invade Latin America to control it. It just needs to buy it. China is now the top trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina. In 2023, China-Latin America trade hit $500 billion, more than U.S.-Latin America trade. Debt: Venezuela owes China $60 billion, money it can't repay. Ecuador, Argentina, and others are in similar positions. Beijing isn't just a lender, it's a creditor-colonizer. China is building ports, railways, and 5G networks across the region. The most critical? The deepwater port at La Guaira, Venezuela, which, according to U.S. intelligence, is being extended to accommodate Chinese naval vessels. The U.S. has been slow to counter this. Why? Because American corporations see Latin America as a source of cheap labor and raw materials, not a strategic priority. Meanwhile, China sees it as the key to dominating the 21st century economy. 2. Russia's the military spoiler. Moscow doesn't have China's economic leverage, but it has something just as the ability to create chaos. Wagner Russian PMCs have been operating in Venezuela since 2019, training Maduro's security forces and running gold smuggling operations to bypass U.S. sanctions. Arms Venezuela is now the second largest buyer of Russian weapons in the Western Hemisphere. S-300 air defense systems, T-72 tanks, and most worryingly, Kilo-class submarines. Nuclear. In 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a nuclear cooperation agreement. No one knows what that means yet, but the US is terrified it could lead to a Russian nuclear presence in the Caribbean. Russia's goal isn't to control Latin America. It's to make sure the US can't. 3. The US. The desperate hegemon. Washington's strategy in Latin America is a mess. And it's getting worse. Sanctions. The U.S. has imposed over 1,000 sanctions on Venezuela since 2017. The result? Maduro is still in power, and the Venezuelan people are suffering. Military. The U.S. has 76 military bases in Latin America. But most of them are lightly staffed, underfunded, and focused on counter-narcotics, not great power competition. Diplomatic. The last time a U.S. president visited Latin America was Obama in 2016. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping has visited 5 times in the last 3 years. The U.S. still acts like it's 1999. But the world has changed. And Venezuela is the perfect example of how Washington's outdated strategy is failing. Military and strategic. The dominoes are falling. So what happens now? Let's start with the immediate military response. Within 72 hours of the Oceanic Horizon incident, the U.S. did the 1. Deployed the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to the Caribbean, ostensibly for routine exercises, but in reality, to project power within striking distance of Venezuela. 2. Activated the 101st Airborne Division for a training deployment to Colombia. The 101st isn't a light infantry unit, it's an air assault force designed for rapid insertion into hostile territory. 3. Exited the freedom of navigation operations in the Caribbean, with daily patrols by U.S. Navy destroyers. 4. Authorized the CIA to begin direct action operations against Russian and Chinese assets in Venezuela. Now, here's the scary: none of this is happening in a vacuum. Russia has responded by sending 2 Kilo-class submarines to Venezuelan waters, subs that can fire caliber cruise missiles with a range of 1,500 miles. That puts Miami, Houston, and New Orleans within striking distance. China has deployed a Type 054A frigate to the region, officially for anti-piracy operations, but in reality, to monitor U.S. movements. Iran has sent a replenishment ship to Venezuela, carrying ballistic missile components. This is not a drill. This is escalation in real time. And here's the: no one wants a war. Not the US, not Russia, not China. But when you have 3 nuclear-armed powers operating in close proximity, with competing interests, misaligned intelligence, and no clear red lines, the risk of accidental conflict skyrockets. Let me tell you something I've learned from studying every major war in the last 100 wars: don't start because leaders want them. They start because leaders miscalculate. And right now, everyone is miscalculating. The domestic political why: this is about more than Venezuela. Here's the part no one in Washington wants to talk: this crisis isn't just about geopolitics. It's about American politics. Let's be honest, Joe Biden doesn't want a war with Venezuela. Neither does Donald Trump, if he wins in November. But both of them are being pushed toward escalation by forces beyond their control. 1. The 2024 election hangover. Biden's approval ratings are in the toilet. The economy is stagnant. The border is a disaster. And the one thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on? Looking tough on foreign policy. For a strong response to Venezuela plays well with swing state voters who care about immigration and national security. For Venezuela is low-hanging fruit. He can frame it as Biden's weakness allowed Maduro to threaten America. The result? Both sides are incentivized to escalate. 2. The military-industrial complex's wish list. The Pentagon has been lobbying for years to extend its presence in Latin America. Why? China's port deals threaten U.S. naval dominance. Russia's arms sales undermine U.S. influence. Venezuela's collapse is creating a humanitarian crisis that could destabilize the region. The Oceanic Horizon incident gave them the perfect excuse to push for more funding, more bases, and more counter-China operations. 3. The Cuba precedent. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? The U.S. almost went to war with the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. Why? Because no great power tolerates a rival's military presence in its backyard. Today, the U.S. is terrified of a Chinese-Russian-Iranian axis in the Caribbean. And Venezuela is the weakest link in that chain. So when Maduro attacked that ship, he didn't just provoke a diplomatic spat. He triggered a geopolitical IC in Washington. Scenario: how this ends. Let's game this out. Here are the 3 most likely scenarios, and none of them are good. Scenario 1: the controlled escalation. The U.S. imposes a naval blockade on Venezuela, cutting off its oil exports. Russia and China condemn the move but don't intervene militarily. Venezuela backs down, releases the ship's crew, and the crisis de-escalates. The U.S. wins a short-term victory, but Maduro survives, and China and Russia double down on their investments. Why? It's because this is not a sustainable solution. Venezuela will find other ways to retaliate: cyber attacks, drug trafficking, or even asymmetrical strikes against U.S. interests in the region. Scenario 2: the proxy war. The U.S. arms and funds a new anti-Maduro insurgency. Russia increases its military support for Maduro, possibly deploying more Wagner operatives. China stays on the sidelines but continues economic penetration. Venezuela becomes a failed state, with guerrilla warfare, mass migration, and a permanent U.S. military presence. Why? It's because this is Iraq 2.0. The U.S. will get bogged down in another endless conflict, while China and Russia benefit from the chaos. Scenario 3: the Great Power Showdown. The U.S. The Great Power Showdown is the scenario that keeps Pentagon planners up at night, and for good reason. The U.S. hasn't faced a direct military challenge in its near abroad since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Back then, the Soviets blinked first. But this time, the calculus is different. Russia isn't the Soviet Union, it's a wounded but still dangerous power, and China isn't just a rising economic giant, it's a peer competitor with a blue water navy that didn't exist during the Cold War. Let me explain why this third scenario is far more plausible than most analysts want to admit. First, we have to understand the military balance in the Caribbean. The U.S. Southern Command has long treated the region as its private lake. The last time a foreign power seriously challenged that dominance was during the Falklands War in 1982, when the UK had to project force 8,000 miles to defend its territory. Today, Russia and China don't need to send fleets halfway across the world, they just need to park a few assets in Venezuela, and suddenly, the US has a problem on its doorstep. Now, what most people don't realize is how close we already are to that reality. In 2020, Russia deployed two Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela, nuclear-capable aircraft that can reach the U.S. mainland. The Pentagon downplayed it as a show of force, but the message was Moscow can project power into the Western Hemisphere at will. Then, in 2022, China and Venezuela signed a military cooperation agreement, including joint naval exercises. And just last year, Iran sent warships to Venezuela, the first time an Iranian naval group had ever entered the Atlantic. None of these moves were coincidences. They were deliberate steps to erode U.S. dominance in what Washington still considers its exclusive sphere of influence. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's attack on the Oceanic Horizon wasn't just a miscalculation, it was a test. A test of U.S. resolve, of NATO's unity, and of how far Russia and China are willing to go to support their client state. And so far, the results are troubling for Washington. The US response has been predictably cautious: sanctions, diplomatic condemnations, and a few naval patrols. But if Maduro had actually sunk that ship, or if he escalates further, the US would be forced to respond militarily. And that's when things get dangerous. Let's talk about the military implications. The US has a massive advantage in conventional forces, but Venezuela isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a country with a population of 28 million, a standing army of 123,000, and a stockpile of Russian-made S-300 air defense systems. More importantly, it's a country that has spent the last decade preparing for asymmetrical warfare. The Venezuelan military has been training with Hezbollah operatives, Iranian Quds Force advisors, and Russian Wagner Group mercenaries. They know the US playbook: shock and awe, precision strikes, regime decapitation, and they've been gaming out how to counter it. Now, imagine this: Maduro, facing a US naval blockade, decides to retaliate by mining the entrance to the AMA Canal. Or he orders a cyber attack on US financial systems, with Russian or Chinese assistance. Or he unleashes a wave of migrant crises, overwhelming US border security. None of these are far-fetched. In fact, they're exactly the kind of hybrid warfare tactics that Russia and China have been perfecting for years. And that's the real problem. The US is still thinking in terms of Cold War deterrence, mutually assured destruction, nuclear brinkmanship, clear red lines. But the new great power competition isn't about who has the most nukes. It's about who can control the gray zone between peace and war. And right now, Russia and China are winning that game. Take the 2019 coup attempt in Venezuela. The US-backed Juan Guaidó recognized him as the legitimate president, and even tried to stage a military uprising. It failed spectacularly. Why? Because Maduro had Russian and Cuban intelligence operatives embedded in his security apparatus, feeding him real-time intelligence on US and opposition movements. That's not just a tactical advantage, that's a strategic one. It means that any US military intervention in Venezuela would be met with a level of resistance far beyond what we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, let's bring this back to the oceanic horizon. The ship wasn't just a random target. It was a deliberate provocation, designed to force the US to reveal its hand. And so far, the US has played it safe. But safe isn't a strategy. It's an invitation for further aggression. The question is, how long can Washington afford to play it safe before the cost of inaction becomes higher than the cost of action? Here's what I think is going to happen, and the US will continue to ratchet up the pressure: more sanctions, more naval patrols, maybe even a limited cyber offensive. But Maduro won't back down. He can't. His survival depends on defiance. And Russia and China will continue to prop him up, not out of loyalty, but because they see Venezuela as a critical node in their broader strategy to undermine US hegemony. The real danger isn't that Venezuela will become a second Cuba. It's that it will become a second Syria, a failed state where great powers wage proxy wars, where non-state actors thrive, and where the US finds itself trapped in a quagmire of its own making. And the worst part? The American public won't even realize it's happening until it's too late. Because here's the thing about gray zone: it's designed to be deniable. A cyber attack here, a disinformation campaign there, a few mercenaries on the ground. By the time the US realizes it's at war, the battlefield will already be lost. And that, more than any naval blockade or military strike, is the scenario that should keep policymakers awake at night. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's gamble with the oceanic horizon wasn't just about testing US resolve, it was about consolidating power at home. You see, Venezuela's domestic politics have become a high-stakes game of survival, where every move is calculated to keep the military and the ruling elite invested in the regime's continuity. The attack on that ship wasn't just an international incident, it was a message to the generals: and we are still in control, and we can still defy the gringos. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan military is not a monolith. It's a fractured institution, with factions that range from hardline Chavistas to pragmatic opportunists who would sell out Maduro in a heartbeat if they thought they could get away with it. The last time we saw serious cracks in the military's loyalty was in April 2019, when Juan Guaidó, then the self-proclaimed interim president, called for a military uprising. The plan was key officers would defect, the National Guard would stand down, and Maduro would be forced out. It failed because the Russians and Cubans had already penetrated the high command, but it also failed because the military's rank and file had no incentive to risk everything for a political transition that might leave them worse off. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro has spent the last decade turning the Venezuelan military into a criminal enterprise. The generals don't just control the armed forces, they control the drug trade, the gold mines, the food imports, and the black market fuel sales. In 2020, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned Diosdado Cabello, the regime's second-in-command, for running a narcotics trafficking network that allegedly shipped cocaine to the U.S. through Central America. That same year, the DEA indicted Nicolas Maduro himself on drug trafficking charges, offering a $15 million reward for his capture. These aren't just symbolic moves, they're acknowledgments that Venezuela's military elite has become a transnational criminal organization with uniforms. So when Maduro orders an attack on a foreign vessel, he's not just flexing geopolitical muscle. He's reminding the generals that he's the only one who can protect their illicit revenue streams. The message is: if you abandon me, you lose everything. And that's why, despite the economic collapse, despite the mass exodus of over 7 million Venezuelans, despite the sanctions and the diplomatic isolation, the regime hasn't collapsed. The military has too much to lose. But here's where the scenario gets even more dangerous. The longer Maduro stays in power, the more the military's criminal interests become entrenched. We're already seeing this play out in the gold mines of southern Venezuela, where the National Guard runs protection rackets for illegal mining operations. The same pattern is emerging in the oil sector, where corrupt officials siphon off crude to sell on the black market. The regime isn't just surviving, it's evolving into something far more resilient and far more difficult to dislodge. Now, let's talk about the opposition. For years, the U.S. and its allies have bet on Juan Guaidó as the face of Venezuela's democratic resistance. But Guaidó's moment has passed. His approval ratings have plummeted, and his coalition has splintered. The problem isn't just that he failed to deliver on his promise of regime change, it's that the opposition itself has become a victim of its own fragmentation. In 2021, the Venezuelan opposition boycotted the legislative elections, only to see Maduro's allies take full control of the National Assembly. That was a strategic blunder, and it handed the regime a veneer of legitimacy it didn't deserve. The reality is that Venezuela's opposition is in disarray. The younger generation of activists is exhausted, the older generation is discredited, and the international community is losing interest. The Biden administration has quietly shifted its focus from regime change to damage control, engaging in back-channel negotiations with Maduro's envoys in exchange for limited sanctions relief. That's not a strategy, it's an admission of defeat. Here's what I think is going to happen, and Maduro will continue to play the long game. He'll allow a few token concessions, maybe a prisoner swap, maybe a slight easing of oil sanctions to keep the U.S. off balance. But he won't make any real reforms, because reforms would threaten the military's grip on power. Meanwhile, the economy will continue to deteriorate, and the exodus of Venezuelans will accelerate. We're already seeing this in Colombia, Peru, and Chile, where the influx of migrants is fueling political backlash. That backlash will eventually force the U.S. to act, not out of concern for Venezuela's democracy, but out of fear of regional instability. And that's when the real crisis will begin. Because by the time the U.S. is forced to intervene, the situation on the ground will be far worse than it is today. The military will have fully merged with the criminal underworld, the opposition will be even more divided, and the country will be on the brink of becoming a failed state. At that point, the options will be either accept Maduro's rule as a permanent fixture of the Western Hemisphere, or risk a military intervention that could spiral into a regional conflict. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a problem that can be managed. But that's a fantasy. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a geopolitical time bomb, and the fuse is already lit. The question isn't whether the explosion will happen, it's when, and whether the U.S. will be prepared to deal with the fallout. And right now, I don't see anyone in Washington who's even thinking that far ahead. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about Venezuela, it's a story about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America, and the U.S. is sleepwalking into the next phase of that collapse. The establishment narrative in Washington treats Venezuela as an isolated case, a tragic but containable crisis. But that's like treating a forest fire as a single burning tree. The truth is, Venezuela's implosion is accelerating a broader regional realignment, one that's already reshaping domestic politics from Bogota to Buenos Aires, and the US is woefully unprepared for the consequences. Let me explain why this matters for the domestic political landscape inside Venezuela itself. Maduro's survival isn't just about repression, it's about the careful management of a fractured elite. The military, the Chavista Old Guard, and the emerging criminalized factions within the state are locked in a delicate balance of power. The recent incident with the Guaycurí, where a Venezuelan patrol boat opened fire on a Guyanese-flagged vessel in disputed waters, wasn't just a miscalculation in foreign policy. It was a deliberate signal to those factions that Maduro remains in control, capable of escalating when necessary to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from internal divisions. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime is no longer just a dictatorship. It's a hybrid entity, part authoritarian state, part criminal syndicate, with the military acting as the enforcer of both. The generals aren't just loyal to Maduro, they're loyal to the system that allows them to profit from gold smuggling, drug trafficking, and the black market oil trade. Take General Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister. He's been in power since 2014, surviving multiple purges and US sanctions. Why? Because he's the linchpin of that system. If he falls, the entire edifice could collapse or worse, fracture into warring factions. That's why Maduro keeps him close, even as he publicly humiliates him to remind everyone who's really in charge. But here's where it gets interesting. The opposition, for all its failures, isn't dead, it's just evolving in ways that Washington refuses to acknowledge. The younger generation of activists, the ones who led the 2017 protests and the 2019 uprising, are no longer marching in the streets. They're either in exile, in prison, or working underground. But they're not giving up. They're adapting. You see it in the rise of decentralized resistance networks, like the ones that organized the 2020 Operation Gideon fiasco, a botched mercenary incursion that, for all its incompetence, revealed just how desperate some factions are to force change. You see it in the growing influence of diaspora communities, particularly in Florida and Spain, where exiled Venezuelans are building political and financial networks to fund opposition efforts back home. The problem is that the opposition's traditional leadership, figures like Juan Guaidó and Leopoldo López, are increasingly irrelevant. Guaidó's interim government, which the US recognized as Venezuela's legitimate authority from 2019 to 2023, was a noble experiment, but it failed because it was built on the assumption that international pressure alone could force Maduro out. It didn't. López, for his part, remains a polarizing figure, seen by many as too close to Washington and too disconnected from the realities on the ground. The new opposition isn't looking for a savior, it's looking for a strategy. And right now, that strategy is shifting toward a long-term war of attrition, one that chips away at the regime's legitimacy rather than trying to topple it in one fell swoop. This brings me to the most dangerous miscalculation in Washington's: the belief that time is on the side of democracy. It's not. Time is on the side of the regime. Every day that Maduro stays in power, the state becomes more criminalized, the opposition more fragmented, and the population more desperate. The US thinks it can wait this out, that sanctions and diplomatic pressure will eventually force Maduro to the negotiating table on Washington's terms. But that's not how this works. Maduro isn't going to negotiate his way out of power, he's going to outlast the opposition, outmaneuver the US, and consolidate his control over the levers of the state. Look at the numbers. In 2015, Venezuela's GDP was $371 billion. By 2023, it had collapsed to $92 billion, a 75% contraction. Yet Maduro is still standing. How? Because the regime has adapted. It's abandoned the formal economy in favor of a shadow system where the military controls the flow of dollars, gold, and oil. The sanctions that were supposed to cripple the regime have instead forced it to become more self-sufficient, more ruthless, and more integrated with global criminal networks. The US thought it could strangle Venezuela's economy and force a political transition. Instead, it's created a monster, a state that no longer needs the global financial system to survive. Now, let's talk about the domestic political scenarios that could play out in the next 2 to 3 years. There are 3 broad possibilities, and none of them are good for U.S. interests. The first is what I call the Zimbabwe scenario. Maduro digs in, the economy continues to stagnate, and the regime becomes a permanent fixture of the region, propped up by China, Russia, and Iran. The opposition is crushed, the military remains in control, and Venezuela becomes a de facto narco-state, exporting instability across the hemisphere. This is the most likely outcome, and it's the one the US is least prepared to handle. Why? Because it doesn't fit into Washington's binary framework of democracy versus dictatorship. It's something far more: a failed state with a functioning security apparatus, capable of projecting power beyond its borders. The second scenario is the Sudan scenario. The regime fractures, the military splits, and Venezuela descends into civil conflict. This could happen if Maduro loses control of key factions within the military, or if a major economic shock, like a collapse in oil prices, triggers a power struggle. The problem here is that the US has no plan for what comes in. Do we intervene? Do we arm the opposition? Do we let the country burn? The last time the US faced a similar dilemma was in Libya in 2011, and we all know how that turned out. The difference is that Venezuela is far more strategically important, and the spillover effects would be catastrophic for Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The third scenario is the Belarus scenario. Maduro holds a sham election, declares victory, and the international community either accepts it or imposes symbolic sanctions that do nothing to change the reality on the ground. This is the path of least resistance for the US, but it's also the most dangerous in the long run. Because it sends a message to every authoritarian leader in the "you can get away with anything as long as you're useful to the great powers." Look at Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega has been in power for nearly 2 decades, and the US has done little more than impose targeted sanctions on a handful of officials. The result? Ortega is more entrenched than ever, and Nicaragua is now a satellite of Russia and Iran. Here's the bottom: Venezuela is not a problem that can be managed. It's a problem that's going to explode, and when it does, the US will be caught flat-footed. The Biden administration's approach, limited sanctions relief in exchange for token concessions, isn't a strategy. It's a band-aid on a gaping wound. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed. The Obama administration's engagement failed. The Cheney-era saber-rattling failed. And yet, Washington keeps recycling the same tired playbook, as if this time it'll work. The real question isn't whether Maduro will fall, it's whether the US is prepared for what comes in, and right now, the answer is a resounding no. The State Department is understaffed, the intelligence community is distracted by Ukraine and the Middle East, and Congress is too polarized to agree on anything beyond performative outrage. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. The longer this drags on, the worse the outcome will be for Venezuela, for the region, and for US national security. I'll leave you with this thought. In 1998, Hugo Chavez won his first election with 56% of the vote. He was a populist, a nationalist, a man who promised to break the old political order. 25 years later, his successor is presiding over a country that's a shadow of what it once was. The tragedy of Venezuela isn't just that it's a failed state, it's that it didn't have to be this way. The US had opportunities to shape the outcome, to support democratic forces, to push for meaningful reforms. Instead, it chose short-term fixes, half measures, and wishful thinking. Now, we're left with a country that's a geopolitical black hole, sucking in instability from across the region. And the worst part? We're still not paying attention.